So look, thank you for allowing me to come along today and speak to you a little bit about my work, but also more broadly the topic of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research and you know, the idea of how it's evolved over the last little while. I really loved your presentation, Vanessa. It was wonderful, and it sparked a lot of thoughts for me. So before I begin, as I had previously, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we respectively meet, to First Nations internationally, to elders past, present, and those emerging. And I'd like to thank those diverse and numerous First Nations for the opportunity afforded to me as an Aboriginal man and descendant of one of the oldest living cultures on the planet to speak here today. So as I mentioned in my acknowledgement of country, you know, just a little bit of historical and geographical context with respect to Australia. You know, I've overlaid, as you can see there, a map of Australia against North America. And, you know, Australia in itself is almost equal in size to the continent of North America. It's also about twice the size of Europe if we exclude, you know, Moscow, Russia, and so forth, and those other countries. It's a very big place. It's also a very old place, you know, 60,000 plus years of history pre-European occupation. Yet we use the term Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander to conveniently refer to a diverse group of peoples. We use Aboriginal to refer to the collective of First Nations peoples of mainland Australia, an area that pre-European colonisation, you know, represented some 400 language groups. And we're sometimes blind to the fact that Aboriginal mainland First Nations peoples are a different collective to Torres Strait Islander peoples, where the Torres Strait Islands that area north of Cape York, Queensland, and include over 200 islands, 17 of which are populated, representing 5 traditional island clusters. And just to put it into perspective, I wonder if people, just in terms of, you know, sort of reflecting, how would you feel if I only acknowledged or paid respect to your ancestry in connection to Ireland, Scotland, England, France, Latvia, Germany, Ukraine, Romania, Greece, Bulgaria, Italy, Spain, or Portugal, just to name a few, and referred to you as European? So just a little bit of thought. Convenience is no excuse for laziness. And I think that's probably going to be a little bit of a theme across today's conversation as I sort of go into some of the things that, you know, I've had the experience and the privilege to be involved with, but also a little bit of my own personal and professional views around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. I'm going to refer to a body of work that we've done in the genomics space and the process that we went through that, the outcomes, key learnings, recommendations. But at the start of this presentation, I just want to give a little bit of thought to this process, to this concept that we refer to as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. In terms of health statistics, you'll all be very aware that life expectancy is extraordinarily challenging when you're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander statistics and life statistics compared to non-Indigenous life statistics. And, you know, it's a factor that varies across regions and remoteness. What I would say, though, is be cautious of that discourse, you know, and there's a publication here that I've referenced, which is from the Lowitja Institute, which is the peak body nationally for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, which refers to a deficit discourse and a strength-based approach, the importance of acknowledging that when we start a conversation which principally privileges, you know, a voice around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health deficit, we really disempower that group. And deficit discourse refers to discourse that represents people or groups in terms of deficiency, absence, lack, or failure, and denotes discourse that narrowly situates responsibility for problems with affected individuals or communities, overlooking a larger socioeconomic structure in which they are embedded. So like I say, have a look at that if you're interested to read more on that, but I would just say, just be cautious of what health statistics say and how they're used, and the type of narrative that they create, and whether that actually privileges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, or an ontology or epistemology which is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led. So you might also be aware of this document, which is the IATSIS, or the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. And similarly, the link is there. You can also just do a search for it. You'll find it. But within this document, which I believe came out in 2020, a couple of years ago now, it defines Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research as all research that impacts or is of significance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including the planning, collection, analysis, and dissemination of information or knowledge in any format or medium, which is about or may affect Indigenous peoples, either collectively or individually. And this notion of collective benefit versus individual benefit is particularly relevant when we consider that we're coming from a position which is community-centric, collective sort of centric, and not individualistic per se. You know, it's more of a reflection of modern Western times that we emphasize the rights of the individual over the rights of the collective. So, and they're supportive of one another. And there's a dynamic that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about these sorts of things from a cultural sort of a perspective. Another document that might be of use or interest to you is a document, it's a couple of years old now, 2016, by the Australian National University, that talks about this concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. And in the genomic space, it's particularly important that we think about data sovereignty. And we think about data not only from the perspective of actual data, but also from the perspective of biospecimens collected from individuals or derived from individuals, and the data that is extracted or, you know, from that data. And this concept of data sovereignty is linked with Indigenous peoples' rights to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, their traditional knowledge and cultural expressions, as well as their right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property. So here in Queensland, we also have this very recent piece of work that's happening, which is called the health equity sort of framework and a promise of equity. So from a health service perspective, you know, there is a document available and there is a real push going forward to realise this vision of equitable access to quality services that are sensitive to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander needs, and also preference Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights with respect to self-determination and sovereignty, and the ability to make decisions about what constitutes effective quality healthcare. And also obviously the right to be free of discrimination, social disadvantage, and racism, more frankly, as it applies to people accessing services. So you can similarly have a look at that document if you're interested. And as I said, just do a search for equity, health equity framework, and you should find something along those lines, but the link is there as well. All right, for the next little part, and I'm conscious of time because I do have a fair amount of things to get through, but I will try my best. I want to just talk just a little bit about this idea of evolving research practice. I want to talk about it from the perspective of research on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. When we think about research on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, historically we're talking about the kind of work that was performed on people with or even without their consent. The narrative typically reflected a benefit for all and incidental recruitment without a perceived need to deliberately involve or privilege Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research ontology or epistemology. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not typically valued as partners, leaders, or stakeholders who needed to be consulted in this type of work. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were generally thought of as subjects of the study. From the for perspective, the narrative reflects a type of discourse, deficit discourse, and language describes the burden of illness, ill health, poor lifestyle choices, and promotes a saviour mentality. It promotes a sense of urgency, a call to action by non-Indigenous researchers to address a gap in health equity and a gap in the quality of life, a health need or a health priority. It talks about prevalence and incidence of illness, and the research team is predominantly non-Indigenous and operationalising and emphasising a technical skill set that will help to address the identified problem. It's typically researcher-driven research, or what we refer to as that. And there's minimal, if any, benefit in the form of remunerated research roles for Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander persons, and no intent, foresight, or history of a commitment to the need, desire, or potential of an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health research workforce. And what I mean by that is teams typically describe a long-term commitment to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health research, but no evidence or track record of supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers across the spectrum of supporting, assisting, leading, developing, or championing the research. No succession planning that articulates an intent to hand over the research agenda to an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. And that's important if we're talking about self-determination and sovereignty. So with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and this tends to be a lot of the work that we see nowadays, but there's clear partnership with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and champions. There's a clear path to translation and benefit and impact from a health perspective. There's clear involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and researchers across the development of the proposal, the protocol, and the outputs, i.e. the publications of the project. And there's a clear confirmation by the community, that is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, of the importance, significance, and need for the research. It's community-driven research. And the shared benefit is obviously there and articulated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons, researchers, organisations, and the community from a financial leadership and governance and perspective. And the CI team includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons. So what about research by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So if we're saying this is the gold standard, this is what, ultimately we want to work towards, CIA is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. The research benefit from a financial, employment, impact, intellectual property perspective reflects a real-world benefit for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Decisions about the collection, storage, and repatriation of biospecimens, so this is in particular in relation to genomics research and so forth, or derived from Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people, are governed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and interests, and in a way that acknowledges the importance of both individual and collective consent, decision-making rights and responsibilities, and the right to self-determine, both as a collective and as individuals. Access to data is governed by a representative group autonomously and in accordance with the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. And the majority of the research team comprise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons with complementary skills and expertise. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of being, doing, and knowing are actually valued, reflected, privileged, and prioritised in the research protocol. And the role of non-Indigenous research project personnel is supplementary and supportive, technical expertise, and essentially subcontracted to do the parts of the research that are not able to be led by an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. So that's my, like I said, my views on what research looks like from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective, and the varying sort of spectrum of what constitutes research for, by, with, and on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, the next part of my presentation, I'm just going to speak about a little bit of work that we did in the genomics space in particular. This work was funded by Queensland Genomics, and I would like to acknowledge the project steering committee that we had that supported us across this work, all of our university partners, in particular QUAKE, who are the Queensland Aboriginal Islander Health Council, and also Queensland Health and their Genetic Health Queensland services, as we've worked together for the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, about 4 years worth of work that went from a policy space, essentially, which is a framework for action, confirming preferences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with respect to genomic research, to a public awareness and health literacy space, and finally to a health reform space. Not bad for 4 years to go from policy to health literacy and finally end on health reform. So I'll try and do this as best I can and as quickly, clearly, and concisely So in terms of the health service environment in Queensland, we're talking about both tertiary health, public hospital health services, and we're talking about primary health, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health organisations, of which there are 46. From the public hospital and health perspective, it's a tertiary health system. Public hospital and health services operate from a biomedical sort of a model, illness-centric and acute care focus, typically. From a primary health perspective, we take much more of a community-controlled, holistic perspective, person, family, and community-centric. So not just person-centered, but also family and community-centric. And we tend to focus on more of those upstream determinants: prevention, promotion, early intervention. Now, I'm just going to very quickly, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, just in terms of the history of significance with respect to genomics and genetics. As you may be aware, there have been a number of projects, and in particular, Human Genome Diversity Project that was around about 20 years ago, that looked to collect samples from all over the world to represent the diversity of the human genome. And some of that work happened without consent historically. And when the Human Genome Diversity Project was first proposed, there were a number of First Nations peoples from across the world, as you can see on this map, that actually opted out of being involved in that work. And that was because of concerns from a historical perspective and a lack of trust, you know, which was founded and real and probably justified with respect to research. So that's, you know, Australia, the Americas, you know, parts of Europe, New Zealand and so forth, and you know, parts of South America actually, you know, decided not to be involved in that. And that had implications with respect to the benefit for from genomics and genetics. With respect to genetic health and genetic testing in Queensland, GHQ is a statewide service, and they've been involved with our work the last number of years. They offer both single gene and gene panel testing. They look at whole genome sequencing. Sequencing started to be introduced, and typically patients are referred from cancer, cardiology, prenatal, renal. And between July 2018 and November 2020, approximately 717 patients who identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander attended a total of 1,300 appointments with genetic testing and for genetic testing with GHQ. And you can see that whilst it's a small number, around that 10%, it's actually slightly overrepresentative of the total population of people who GHQ see. So what we wanted to make sure is that GHQ was actually a sensitive service and providing quality services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The policy background, where we started was with consultations across Queensland, first asking people if they wanted to be involved in genomics research. And as this is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices are preferenced in this space. And we wanted to know really what, if they did want to be involved, what that looked like, what were their preferences. So we did a round of consultations around 17 sort of communities across Queensland. And then we went back and we asked them really, you know, if we captured their, you know, preferences in a document which is referred to as Genomic Partnerships, that's been out for a number of years now and which you can download, but it really is guidelines for genomic research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it's a set of guidelines for genomic and genetics researchers. So that's the target audience, but it really articulates the preferences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with respect to their involvement in that type of work. And as you can see, partnerships is emphasised. The next piece of work that we did at the request of the communities and the people that we involved in that first piece was to develop up some health literacy resources. So we went out again. I think I've done around about 60 community consultations and stakeholder consultations over the last 3 years, where we conducted 11 two-hour workshops, really interrogating what people's preferences are with respect to media and medium, what they wanted to know about from a genetics and genomics perspective, what they wanted to know about from a testing perspective, and so forth. We commissioned artists to represent, in the end, some trifold brochures, which were preferred medium for communication of information about genetic testing to people. And as you can see, because Queensland's a fairly large area, we ended up with 8 different brochures that reflect the local artist styles and so forth for each of those areas. So, you know, across the state. We also developed an animation, which I'll show you just quickly now, which is also available on YouTube, which really was something that people, you know, told us how to do, and then we had the opportunity to go and do it. So I'll show it to you. And as I understand, it's very well received, you know, internationally. Now, hopefully this plays and you can hear it.
Your blood, your story. Our world, we are surrounded by things that affect us and make us who we are. Some can make us stronger, some can make us sick. But sometimes when we feel sick, it isn't easy to find out why or how to get better again. Sometimes the answers can be inside of us, in our body and in our blood. Inside of our body exists a world that can tell many stories about us, about our connection to one another and the world we live in, about our connection to earth, air, and water, about our past and our future. We have knowledge inside of us that has been passed down from our ancestors for generations, knowledge that has been handed down to our grandfathers and our grandmothers, fathers and mothers, and so on, all the way to us and our children. All these stories are kept in something called genes. Your genes are made up of your DNA. This is all through your body and all through your blood. Through tests, our doctors can read these gene stories to learn more about our health. This is called genetic testing. Looking at these stories in detail through genetic testing can help your doctor identify medical conditions that we and our families might have or may get in the future. It can tell us the chance of intellectual or physical disabilities, the risk of your baby inheriting a genetic condition, or if you have a family history of a genetic condition such as cancer. Doctors can use the information from genetic testing to design unique treatments that will work better for you. This new technology is called precision medicine, and your doctor can provide advice about whether you should look into genetic testing. Medical research organizations like QAMR Berghofer are working hard to better understand the stories of DNA and genes for the benefit of everyone. Understanding our gene stories on the inside will help us get better on the outside. Through this medical research, we are helping everyone live healthier, happier, and longer lives. Reading gene stories is an important part of understanding conditions such as infectious diseases, mental health, chronic disorders, and cancer. If you or your family have any concerns about your health that might be linked to your gene stories, you can talk to your doctor to discuss your options. If you would like more information about genetic health and genetic testing, you can visit www.health.qld.gov.au/GHQ. Genetic Health Queensland is a free service and is part of the public Queensland Health Service. If you know of someone who might benefit from this information, a family member or friend, please share this video with them. Thank you.
All right. So you can find that video online as well. It's on YouTube. And it's also hosted on the QMR website. So yeah, you're welcome to find that. Now, the final part that I just wanted to speak about was this last piece that we've moved on to, and there's a publication that's just recently come out, which is called the Integrated Genetic Healthcare Framework. But out of the health literacy piece, we've continued to have conversations with the health service sector, the primary health and tertiary hospital health service sector, to develop up a series of recommendations and to co-design a preferred healthcare model. So this is really going from, like I say, literacy to essentially, improving healthcare through coordinated care. So as I said, QUAKE, GHQ, QIMR co-facilitated a series of workshops where we consulted with community reps and champions across the sectors again. We did that from a position of privilege. We were asked to do that. It wasn't so much of, this was a researcher-driven idea. The health literacy piece was a community-driven request. They said, can we have more information? And this was, okay, can we make this mean something at a health service level? And it's interesting that, my colleague Vanessa has suggested that trust is a very important aspect, because you can see here the significance of relationships with respect to research, and in terms of realizing the promise of research for a health benefit really stems from this idea of trust, respect, and recognition. The consultations, they took around about 3 months. It wasn't exhaustive. It was extensive, however, 9 regions, 9 workshops in total. And we ended up with a model that really identified barriers and enablers to improve coordinated healthcare from a workforce perspective, from an integrated service perspective, and from a health promotion perspective. We asked a series of questions of people, and they shared their views, experiences, and opinions. We developed up a referral pathway, the preferred referral pathway. And we also developed a framework which noted 3 principles as core to integrated care, specifically health promotion, workforce development, and coordinated care. In the document itself, you can see it's laid out into those 3 sections, and each of those sections has a number of themes that we explore. And the general layout is key messages arising from the consultations, and then any strategies and recommendations from each of those. For each of those areas: health promotion, coordinated care, and workforce development. Finally, what I would like to say in alignment with this principle of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership is that I'm privileged to be a part of a national group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers who have established a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Genomics Consortium. We were successful last year in attracting some money through a synergy opportunity to establish this. Alex Brown, my colleague, Professor Alex Brown, he is a professor at ANU, is leading that, and it'll be a very exciting couple of years going forward as we essentially look to, govern this space and give direction and influence. And finally, I would like to acknowledge and pay my thanks to the team, more specifically across this body of work that has most recently been integrated genetic healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Greg. You've pointed out to us how heterogeneous, how disparate First Nations populations are.
Yes.
In light of that, when we see decisions about research projects made for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, how appropriate are those decisions, and how could we go about making those decisions in another way?
I think it's like any research project, to be honest with you. We acknowledge limitations, and we think about those in an ethical and honest way, but we don't misrepresent something as being generalizable to any specific group, or more generally to an entire population. So the work that I've had the opportunity to be involved in most recently, that had a Queensland sort of a context. It was jurisdictional. You know, the relevance of it with respect to other groups nationally, that still needs to be interpreted, that still needs to be interrogated, and it needs to be interrogated by those parties who represent or can speak on behalf of those other groups. But I do think it is problematic to suggest, just as we would in any research project, that something that we have done, which is why we're quite specific and deliberate in terms of when we describe who our participants were and the relevance of that work, you know, why we do that, because it may be, you know, that it's not relevant. It does have limitations, and it does need to be interrogated by those different audiences for it to have meaning, or for it to have application, or for it to be relevant. And I think the important thing is, I will add to that, the important thing in addition to that is that we have an obligation, if we are suggesting that something is generalizable, to asking those people and involving them and consulting them.
I'm going to be in touch to pick your brain about something related to this, but Gordon, anything?
Oh, you're muted, Gordon. That's unusual.
Yeah. I know. I actually didn't mute myself. I wasn't muted. No wonder. Greg, obviously, what wonderful talk. You know, 2 years ago we had a talk by one of our lay people about nothing about us without us, and I think that is broadly along the lines of what you're suggesting. And I also note your community consultation, as you said, extensive but not exhaustive. And you mentioned QUAKE, and I'm really interested in the role of peak bodies such as QUAKE in this particular process, and the role of QUAKE in terms of being that ethical oversight, and, you know, just exactly what is that, and how much, I guess, sway they have in what you do, and their importance. I'd be grateful if you could just tease that out a bit.
Yeah, look, QUAKE is the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, community control health organisations across Queensland. And there are similar peak bodies for each of the jurisdictions or states here in Australia. Now, so they don't speak exhaustively on behalf of all of their members. You know, what they offer is an opportunity to support those members in a consolidated way and advocate on behalf of those groups. And what I, you know, at the risk of, and I don't speak on behalf of QUAKE, you know, I would suggest that they would say is that, you know, they are they're a conduit through which to engage these other stakeholders, you know. Now, it is obviously difficult to be, you know, exhaustive in terms of, you know, consultation. And I remember a number of years ago giving a presentation and talking about one of the areas, and I was pulled up on the idea of, you know, that area only goes to here and it doesn't go to there. And, you know, so there is this notion of, you know, we need to be careful of what we do and what we say we're doing, and putting it forward as an exhaustive sort of a thing. It might be extensive, but might not be exhaustive. Similarly, QUAKE has some 46 members, you know. Not all of their 46 members may want to, choose to, or be interested in being involved in a conversation about genomics, but QUAKE is a really good conduit to offer that opportunity up, you know, similarly to a lot of other spaces.
Yeah, and I know you and I have talked about the use of QUAKE in various circumstances. One final one, if I may, Hudson, in terms of that presentation, the video, I mean, that's wonderful because, do you think that works because it provides it in a contextual modality, or just because it puts into coherent language some of these really difficult concepts? And I'm actually thinking of this, and I'm in a broader context, because, you know, sometimes we get information sheets that are just, well, I think we all know, not appropriate. And could they be put in a better modality?
Oh, look, that particular, one of the things that I'm really, so that was developed by the communities with whom, and the stakeholders with whom we consulted. We asked them what they wanted. We asked them the form that they wanted it in. We asked them what core content they wanted to include in it, how they wanted it presented. There's a whole bunch of things in there, like, for instance, the audio references, and there's background music going on, which actually, you know, do various things. There's the imagery, there's the color, there's all of these different aspects that highlight and emphasize certain things. And then the messaging, as you're saying, which is generally relatable, You know, I would say that, you know, communication and the ability to communicate with whomever it is a real skill. You know, it's not just isolated to, you know, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander sort of context. But I would say is that resource, the feedback I've gotten from international audiences and mainstream audiences, it's a really great resource for anyone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the thing that's important about that is in acknowledging that as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander piece of you know, work, is it changes the narrative, it changes the stereotype that we have with respect to capability, with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ability to lead from a health perspective. We're often thought of as the subjects, not necessarily as the leaders with respect to certain things. I will say, however, that in the ethics space, you know, it's generally acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of doing research would be beneficial to a lot of people, inclusively, you know.
Yeah, you know that two years ago we had a presentation using sort of video consent, which was along those lines. But I take your subtlety there about participants versus part of the community. Anyway, I think it's a great modality and really debunks, you know, some of these difficult concepts and ones which in words alone cannot really express what is required from people. Sorry, Hudson, back to yourself.
So then, Greg, what would your model be for an appropriate collaboration between First Nations people, researchers, and non-First Nations researchers from Western conceptual backgrounds?
So if I think about it from a process sort of perspective, when we're thinking about work that we might be interested in doing, you know, it starts with the development of that proposal. One of the most frustrating things as an Aboriginal researcher to receive is a proposal where I'm asked to be an AI or a CI or provide a letter of support for it, and I haven't been involved from inception through to a proposal, and then there is no real role for me in a meaningful way in that project. You know, I'm really—
So you become a token.
Yeah, exactly. I'll become a token. You know, and that has to stop. And I think the reality of the narrative that's going around with respect to ethics and integrity is reflecting that need. You know, meaningful roles, reciprocally beneficial roles, remuneration for time, all of this sort of things, you know, and I think it starts with a conversation. So a researcher, by all means, you know, that's what we're about, is it's about the idea of understanding the body of evidence, the knowledge, you know, with respect to a space. We start a conversation with people who we might want to work with. Now, if our intent or responsibility is to involve Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in that, then we start the conversation and develop that proposal with them, you know. And the other thing I would just quickly say is that responsibility is a very general thing, you know, like it's not just about a project that involves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's about projects that are relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as part of the society in which we live, and probably also as you know, potential beneficiaries of the work that we're proposing to do. So if we're doing a project in you know, looking at, let's say, diabetes, you know, we don't want to think about the fact that we're going to not include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because as a patient cohort, we may be talking about 30%. So there is that responsibility for researchers to actually understand the impact that they propose to have through their work and the implications that that has with respect to special interest populations that the Commonwealth of Australia says are a priority.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you to all.